Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. North Carolina's elections are over. The dust is mostly settled. The top line takeaways: voters here split their tickets, choosing a Republican president and a Democratic governor. That's not a huge surprise in this purple battleground, but there were some trends that emerged on Tuesday, and WRAL state government reporters Paul Specht and Will Doran are here to tell us all about them.
Thanks for having us.
Will, let's start with you. Voters split their tickets, which isn't, again, a big surprise. What's our history there?
Yes, it did come as a surprise to some people, but the fact is North Carolina, ever since the 1968 elections, has been electing Republicans for president, Democrats for governor. There are a handful of exceptions to the rule. Pat McCrory in 2012 won the governorship as a Republican, Barack Obama in 2008 won here as a Democrat for president, but that's about it. There's, you'd have to go back decades to find any other examples of us bucking this trend. So the fact that we voted for Trump and Stein was, while it might seem alien to people outside of North Carolina, it's what we do here in North Carolina. Voters love to do that ticket splitting.
Was there anything in the numbers that stood out to you, either about who voted or where those votes came from?
That's a great question. We saw turnout was down a little bit from 2020, but 2020 also set an all-time record for turnout. So it wasn't the case that people were completely unenergized to come out and vote. It was just, you really saw Trump make up ground compared to 2020, especially in some of the urban areas that are typically these, deep blue, strongholds for Democrats. He improved a little bit in Wake County, improved a little bit in Mecklenburg County. Just kind of part of this, rightward shift that we've seen all across the country.
Now, one of the big things people were watching for was the effect of Hurricane Helene on the elections. Paul, you report that one race went to a Democrat in a deep red Western district. How did that happen?
Right. And, before the election, people speculated that, hey, Helene might affect these big statewide races because out of all the 25 counties that were affected by the flooding and all that, most of them were majority Republican. It did not turn out to be the case for any of the big elections, but there was one that really stands out in the race results, and that's District 115 out in Buncombe County near Asheville. It was redrawn last year to give the Republicans more of an advantage there. In fact, the constituency there voted for Trump by 9 points in the 2020 election. Well, the incumbent there is a Democrat, Lindsey Prather. The Republicans expected to win that district. They lost. Prather won by 3 points. And when we talked to her and when we talked to some of the Republicans in charge of the campaign out there, they said the storm really did disrupt everyone's plans. For Republicans, they had this plan to launch ads about Prather being too left-wing and being out of touch with voters in that district. Prather says she had her own plan, too, and had to adjust. After the storm, rather than, asking people for money, political donations, right, and running her own campaign, she completely switched gears. She told us she started sending out text messages giving people tips on where to find food and where to find other resources in the wake of it. And she just got out there and started helping. She stopped, these personalized attacks against her Republican candidate for a while and just focused on recovery because that's top of mind for people out there. And it's hard not to look at the result in that race where Republicans were favored by 9 points and a Democrat won by 3 and not say, that hurricane had something to do out there.
And her message clearly connected with voters, right? That's what she says, right?
Right. That's what she says. And, she likely gained some notoriety, might be too strong of a word, but she's in that position where she was the incumbent. And so she is the government representative in some capacity to many of these people. And so she has the opportunity to say, hey, I'm with the government. I'm here to help. I know that's a joke in Republican circles, but according to her, people weren't laughing. That wasn't the joke. They were saying, oh, thank God you're here. That's what she told us. Thank God you're here. What can you do to help? And she helped in any way she could.
And that win wasn't just a win in that district. That really helped the Democrats break the GOP supermajority in the legislature.
That's right. The supermajority is a big deal because when Republicans have 60% of the legislative seats, then they can override vetoes by the governor. In recent years, it's been Democrat Roy Cooper And now it will soon be Democrat Josh Stein. So if Republicans were able to win another 60%, then they could continue overriding these vetoes more easily. As the race results stand now, the Republicans have won 71 seats in the 120-seat House. That means they are coming up 1 seat short. And so now there are a couple close races that may have recounts, and there's provisional ballots still out. But when they look back and they see that they came up 1 seat short of the supermajority, they say they're going to look back at Lindsey Prather's race out in Buncombe County, where they had a 9-point advantage, and say, it's hard not to acknowledge that Hurricane Helene made a difference there.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll discuss polls and money and more. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL state government reporters Will Doran and Paul Specht about the 2024 elections. Will, one thing that stood out to me about this election was that people didn't seem to believe the polls going into Tuesday. Did the results Tuesday validate that skepticism?
People have, I would say rightfully, been a little skeptical of polling recently. In the Trump era, we've seen plenty of examples of polls missing. But this year, the polls were pretty much spot on. You know, I'll brag a little bit on the WRAL poll that we put out just a week before the election. It found a 47-47 tie in the presidential race and about 4 or 5% of people undecided. And what we saw in the end, in reality, was Kamala Harris winning 47.5% and Donald Trump winning about 51%. So you might look at it and say, oh, that was off by a percentage point or two. Or you could look at it and say, oh, those undecided voters just basically all broke for Trump when they actually had to make up their minds. And then in the governor's race, our poll was spot on. It was a 15-point margin for Stein, which when that poll came out, a lot of people said, what? I mean, Stein's the favorite, but 15 points is insane. And then Stein wins by exactly 15 points. And we weren't the only ones. ECU had a poll that nailed the governor's race and also got the presidential race almost exactly right. Plenty of polling averages, that national groups do, also showed Trump with a narrow lead in North Carolina, and that's exactly how the race ended up.
Now, as you mentioned, Robinson lost by a wide margin in the gubernatorial race. Did his performance affect any other races?
Well, it's interesting to look at. Republicans are acknowledging now that he may have played a role in some of these, not only the legislative races, but also some of these Council of State seats. And that's something they didn't acknowledge beforehand. We asked them, before the election, do you think these ads that are tying Republican candidates for attorney general, for education superintendent, and for some of these legislative seats, do you think they're making a difference? And they said no. They said their polling, their internal research, did not show people defecting off of specific candidates that were tied to Robinson. Well, here we are, post-election, and Hal Weatherman, the Republican candidate for lieutenant governor, he continued campaigning with Mark Robinson, despite some controversy surrounding the gubernatorial candidate. He put up yard signs with him that said Weatherman Robinson. They went to events together, and Weatherman lost. And he's the first Republican to lose a race for lieutenant governor since 2008. And so analysts we spoke to pointed to that and said, hey, that's a little bit of, it mattered somewhat. You can point to that and say it certainly didn't help. And then there are other races down the ballot too. For instance, there's a Republican incumbent in the House, the State House, Frank Sossamon. He also continued campaigning with Mark Robinson even after some of his controversies. Well, he's down by about 180 votes now. Of course, provisionals are still out, but it appears he lost. Another incumbent Republican, Ken Fontenot, he defended Mark Robinson's abortion comments on Facebook. He lost. He lost by 3 percentage points. So we have some evidence now that we can point to and say, look, some of the people who went out furthest on a limb for Robinson, it fell off. It did not pay off for them. Even in a press conference this week, Republican legislative leaders acknowledged that.
Will, were there any money takeaways, either from fundraising or from the effectiveness of the ad spending?
Yeah, well, exactly what he was just talking about with being able to tie individual Republican candidates to Mark Robinson. You can't do that if you don't have the money to put out ads. And what we saw was that in races where Democrats raised a lot of money and Democrats raised a lot of money for this election, they were able to win. Roy Cooper in 2020 had set a record for fundraising, bringing in $40 million. Josh Stein doubled that. He brought in $77 million. Then we saw tens of millions of dollars more spent in races for Attorney General, for Superintendent of Public Education, all, down the ballot. And all of those races where the Democrats were able to get ads up on TV, they had great success in. It was the races where the Democratic candidates didn't have the money to get ads on TV where the Republicans all won. So we have 14 statewide races here in North Carolina other than the presidency for, state offices. And that's the 10 Council of State races plus the 4 statewide judicial seats that were on the ballot. And of those 14 races, Democrats had TV ads up in 7 of them. And they have won at least 5 of those 7 and might end up winning 6 of the 7, depending on how the Supreme Court race goes. That one is still potentially in the range for the recount, depending on how the provisional ballots go. So we don't know the results of that one. But, in the races where the Democrats had enough money to run ads, they won at least 5, maybe 6 out of those 7.
Now, Republicans had a good night with the presidential election, with judicial races and congressional seats. Paul, you report that there were some silver linings, though, for Democrats. What were they?
Right. And starting with some of those races Will just mentioned, I think if you're a Democrat and you played a role in some of these campaigns, or if you're a donor, you look at the race for governor, the race for attorney general, the lieutenant governor's race, the race for education superintendent, and you say, I got my money's worth. We raised all this money. If you're a donor, we gave this money, and it paid off. You won big statewide races, and that's a huge change from 2022 when Democrats won no statewide races. It led to upheaval at the state Democratic Party where they ousted their chairperson. And so that's a big deal for them. That is a big deal. Here's the other silver lining for them. In an election where many states lurched rightward by several percentage points, when you look at, how much Trump won or lost by in the 2020 election compared to how much he won by in 2024, North Carolina only moved by about 1.5%. That is much less than other battleground states such as Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, and some other historically liberal states like California and New York went even further to the right. Of course, Trump didn't win those states, but man, he moved the needle a lot. And so you may look at North Carolina and say, why did this happen? North Carolina typically goes red. You would think in an election where there's what appears to be a red wave, North Carolina would follow that trend, but it didn't. And so we asked Jessica Taylor at the Cook Political Report, why is that? Why did a historically red state not move further to the right? She said, it's the power of our cities. Our urban areas are historically liberal, and they're growing. That's where all the population centers are, and they're continuing to get big. So in areas that are already liberal, they're getting more liberal and more populated. That influences the vote, and if you're a Democrat, makes you hopeful for the future. We're going to be a battleground state in 2026 when incumbent Republican Tom Tillis is up for re-election. He's our U.S. Senator. Expect there to be millions and millions of dollars spent here. For one, because he's vulnerable, and because two, people can now see that their dollars are a good investment.
Well, lots will happen between now and 2026, and I know that you'll be covering it along the way. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
That's Will Doran and Paul Specht of our NC Capitol team for their breakdown of the 2024 elections. And for all of our election coverage, go to the NC Capitol section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.